continuing Calvin's Institutes, chapter 5, sections 11 through 15. Essentially, we could summarize it to say we are all naturally very dense, dull, short-sighted, blind when it comes to discerning the true living God from nature alone, even though it can get us, I'd say, a lot of the way there. So even though we are all, Calvin would say, peculiar in how we get things wrong, which is why you would say you have such a diversity of gods and religions and even subsects of unique beliefs or practices within even the most isolated and particular religions, even though natural man is so different in fictitious phantom gods that we create for ourselves, we are all alike in making the same horrid substitution generally. That Calvin says this: we substitute monstrous fictions for the one living and true God, and that is the disease of sin, which no man on his own is able to eradicate apart from grace. We all make that horrid substitution, the monstrous substitution, our fictitious gods for the one living and true God, seen in Psalm 2, which Calvin is going to get there. That's essentially what nations do. Nations without God tend in the same direction that natural man without God does, simply with more power and with more pride. What does Psalm 2 say? Rule number one of a pagan nation is to remove their enslavement, as they view it, from the one living and true God, and if necessary, substitute it with false gods. Calvin references Plato as this being true for him, even though he was the soberest, the most level and even-headed, and the most religious of all, yet he still falls here. And in fact, the higher that he attempts to take his thoughts into the heavenly realms, the duller and the more wrong he seemed to get things. And that was, in Calvin's estimation, the best of them, that is, of the poets and philosophers. In terms of how nations behave like fallen men, he gives the example of the Egyptians, who were painstakingly rational and wanted to be perceived by all as logical and rational thinkers. But eventually, what did they need to do? They needed to discard the knowledge of the true God and replace it with fictions, either actively or passively. And you could see that historically, although Calvin doesn't necessarily highlight this, maybe he will later, in the downfall of Egypt post Joseph, and Joseph's positive influence as a patriarch and ruler number 2 in all the land of Egypt. It was 400 years from what was probably religiously a relatively sober time compared to what you have in the age of Moses. But here is this thought that natural man can discern so much from the created order, but the higher he goes to things beyond creation, into the heavens, the duller he behaves, the duller he becomes. And he gives the example of Simonides, who was a wise philosopher of man, and this is sort of a parable type story. Maybe it was true, maybe not, but this guy Simonides was brought before the then king of the Greco-Roman world, King Hiero. And King Hiero put to him a simple question, demanding that he answer, "What is God?" And Simonides sometimes applauded for his response. You could take it one way or the other. But this guy, Simon, basically says, look, I want a day to consider my answer. The king gives him a day. He comes back. I still got nothing. Can I have 2 days to consider? The king allows it. He comes back. I need 4 days now to consider. And this redoubling of days from 1 and beyond becomes kind of comical. And finally, King Hiero says, look, just give me an answer. And Simonides is applauded for his humility and honesty. What is God? His answer: the longer I consider, the darker the subject appears. The longer I consider, the darker the subject appears. Yes, that is natural man. Calvin notes, in terms of applying this somewhat to the church, that we must be extra careful, therefore, in our worship, seeing how wrong we can get it. The more our minds sort of detach and go their own direction. He gives the example of John 2, Jesus before the Samaritan woman, and in fact the Samaritans, they were, we could say, geographically and practically speaking, they had the Torah, they were intermingling and intermixing it in a pluralistic way, forming their religion, but at the least the Samaritans were half right. Yet Jesus professes they are all wrong. So, in terms of our worship, the natural mind would have us be cautious, half right in our worship in the economy of God as he perceives it is not according to spirit and truth, and therefore it is all wrong. Now, essentially, Calvin is building this argument to ultimately do what? Yes, we are able to glory in this remaining witness that God's given in creation. That is both creation and the poets and philosophers who have discerned rightly in regard to who God is in power and wisdom from creation. Yet, we must be careful. This only takes us and can only take us so far. And he's building a solid case for what will come next. We need Scripture to guide us and to teach us. We are, in point of fact, lost without it. Well, thank you for listening. I hope that was beneficial.